it blew my mind that I can have all my businesses in a trust, which then also protects the businesses from creditors and from lawsuits and some of those other things. That's not just Daniel Dixon running everything. We have LLCs that do the things and so on. We have everything encapsulated in this entity that protects as we continue to grow and expand. Welcome back to the Color Money Podcast. Today's a great episode. I have a friend, a coach, another balded and bearded man on the podcast with us, Mr. Marc Dearth. Now, I was connected with Marc through my coach and mentor, Brett Tanner, probably, Marc, 2.5 years ago? Something
Correct.
like that. And it was all built around estate planning, trusts, things that honestly I knew absolutely nothing about. Now, Marc has spent his entire life helping people. His law practice is always focused on complex planning and maximizing the peace of mind through tax savings. So Marc is a founding partner of Dearth Law, and he is the person that we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about the things that I would argue I had no idea. And I think that a lot of people out there, specifically people inside of our community, have no idea what a trust is or why set up a trust or how you set up a trust or any of those additional things. And so I'm really excited about this conversation, because if you work your entire lifetime to build up this empire and you don't have the proper protections in place, then as we pass this thing off, or as you get sued, or as this craziness in life happens, it can all go away if we don't have the proper protections in place. So Marc, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Thank you guys for having me. Looking forward to it.
All right, Emric. So I know we were talking about offline a little bit. Emric said, Marc, I need to get on your calendar. I want one of these appointments. And so I want to bring back what we were talking about originally about being 43 versus 45 and the importance of insurances and some of those differences. Emric, if you could say what you said, and then Marc, I want to have that conversation with you on what the difference is with those different age ranges and why it's important to get these insurances and start this asset protection stuff early.
Well, I figured it out actually by accident, because I got my first big policy right before I turned 45. And then I went to update the policy at 50, and I almost fell out of my seat. I almost fell out of my seat because the thing that happened, it was just crazy with the difference in the cost. And I was like, more people need to have to learn this before they get to my stage in life. And that it was just huge. It's mind altering, just the difference.
Now, Marc, if you could talk a little bit with us about when we think about all the things your firm does. I know your firm does everything, like literally everything. But when we talk about trust, estate planning, and asset protection, let's start with asset protection. What are the different vehicles, or what are the different ways that we use asset protection? Why is it important? Why do people need to pay attention and put these things in place right now before it's too late?
Well, and I think, the old saying, it was one that I love to talk about is, best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. The idea of starting early is generally preferable. I mean, I think it's where most attorneys screw up the process, is particularly in the trust and estate spaces. They talk about dying, and what happens and everything else. Well, the reality is sitting here at 45, even 50, even 65. Like, dying is mathematically the least likely thing to happen in the next 5 years. And so we want to be more mindful of the other important planning items: asset protection, privacy, which is separate and distinct in the leading edge of asset protection, tax minimization, all the other things that we can do that provide meaningful benefits today to have that plan. And it's often cheaper, easier to administer, whatever else, to start earlier rather than later.
Yeah. And I think it's so true just in the insurance world, in the health space, in the asset protection thing. Everything is easier to start sooner. And to be honest, like I'm 38 years old, and I'm like, I don't need to think about this yet. You do that stuff and you set up the empire and the exit later on in life. Like, why do I need to do these things now? Right?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, but the most common, there's always a call to action on planning on people's parts. It could be health scares of family themselves, otherwise, could be lawsuits or whatever else. It's, it's easy to ignore it and get, spend your time on more pressing matters until you get punched in the face with something.
Right.
And so our approach is to say, well, we need to understand, everybody should understand how they own what they own. The most,
Hmm.
interesting thing to me is the best relationships and the best things create the biggest information gaps. I trust my wife implicitly, and I don't know how to log into my bank account. As long as my Amex works, I'm a happy camper and will go about my life. Well, if she's out of town for a month or passes away or whatever, how am I going to learn to do those things?
Yeah.
Making sure that we understand how we access and control our assets, both in the positive and negative, are something we often just don't think about.
And Daniel, you said something about, and we had this conversation before, you and I, about that whole planning. I don't think about things that way because it's too
Yeah.
early for. Well, here's the deal: when you start thinking about, and this is what I learned, and I'm going to use this simple. If you were to get a universal index life policy at 38, it could technically be paid out by the time you 50. It could be paid up by the time you 50. So that means that you won't have to make another payment at 50, and it's asset protection. If you get it at 50, it's almost twice as much. Now you got to pay it until you're 60 to get it to be on an automatic schedule. So do you start at 38 for half the price and get it on an automatic schedule? So by the time you're 50, it's a little more settled, or do you wait until you get 50, get it settled out by the time you're 60 for the same asset protection? It's just, and that's the way
Well, I
I
think
look at it. I say starting younger, because it just puts you in a different mindset. And not only does it put you in a, not only does it set the cycle earlier, it puts you in a different mindset earlier to even start thinking about the possibilities of what you can do. And it's a great feeling when you look down and you're 50 and you say, I don't have enough protection of my assets because I've grown my assets far greater than I believed I would. That's a good
that's
feeling.
a big that's a big conversation. I think when Mark and I first started going through this was like a conversation we had is the thought of being younger and being immortal. And I'm not going to die tomorrow. Like, I'm good. We're good. Like, no. I got 10 more years at least before we have any health issues. And thinking about how do we, again, start this journey younger. And I think, Mark, one of the things that you did incredibly well was we sat down and we would spend hour and a half, 2 hours on the phone walking through the understanding for my wife. Because to your point, as long as your Amex works, you're good to go. But what happens then when the Amex doesn't work? Where do you go first? And that was a lot of what we talked about, is understanding that your partner knows, do we have a succession plan that if we do get hit by a bus, we've mapped out and we've outlined inside of our entities, inside of our world, what your spouse or what your heirs need to do, where they need to go, how they need to do the things, so you know where to go pay the bills so you can still use your Amex card, right?
Well, and truthfully, that's my favorite place to start with. The first recommendation I have with clients, not legal advice at all. We need a system and process, be it, mint.com, financial advisors, spreadsheets, or whatever, where we keep real-time, up-to-date information about our assets and what they are so we understand it. And then we have, I love password managers. I use 1Password. There's other ones as well, but Jamie and I use it as a tool to centralize information. Like now I can log into a bank account if I need to. Still don't want to. Still don't care, but I know where to go to get to it if I need to. And so creating the systems and processes to where life operates easier and information is accessible to close those information gaps is goal number one of any thoughtful plan. And when we do it, it makes life easier. I don't have to go, hunt her down and make sure she's home to find the kids' social security numbers or anything. Now I have a resource to find it. And, it's, when you get well organized and clean systems and processes, it eliminates the micro frustrations of life. Then it allows more, nuanced, thoughtful, complex planning ideas around things to achieve bigger objectives and goals, be it asset protection, privacy, succession planning, or whatever.
Well, I think this really hit home about a year and a half ago. One of my really good friends, one of our agents, she lost her father, and her father was the everything in the family. Paid the bills, set the plans, invested the money, did everything, and all of a sudden, just like that, he was gone. And so everything fell on her mom. And so she's helping her mom sift through everything, and they don't know where everything lives. They don't know who the CPA is, and they don't know all of these things. And so there's sites like Trustworthy that KW Wealth leans into pretty heavy has has everything in one place. And then creating that map to understand what goes where, who's in charge of what, and so on. So I want to switch gears a little bit, Mark. Let's talk about when you think about asset protection. These are things that again didn't compute to me. I didn't really understand that we want to maintain the control of the asset with none of the liability. Let's go down that path for a minute. What does that mean exactly, and how do we achieve something like that?
Well, I think it starts with understanding how we own what we own. Different categories and types of assets have different rights, responsibilities, and obligations. And so, it's common for somebody to walk in my office and say, well, I've got $5 million of assets. I'm worried about being sued for $5 million. Well, when for in a lot of states, retirement accounts are completely asset protected. Life insurance policies are completely asset protected. Certainly real estate with large debt on it is protected, or some debt on it may be protected. And so, really understanding how we own what we own, and knowing that some categories are more protective than others, and understanding what our true liability exposure is. A lot of liability concerns in life can be mitigated and managed through proper insurance coverages. The ones that can't, we need to, craft and build our balance sheet in a way that manages and mitigates those the way we want to.
That's a good point, Mark. And just really quick, I want to use me as a test dummy. Okay, I'm gonna be the little crash. I'm gonna be the crash test dummy. I have an LLC, and there's a commercial, and a lot of times we're misinformed about LLCs. A lot of times, I have an LLC, and I have a commercial property that owns that LLC. What you know, what risk is mitigated by having a property owned by LLC? How does that protect you as an individual?
Well, it's a phenomenal question. I mean, because I think it's where lawyers say things in a shorthand way that probably don't convey the actual protections that is done with that. So everybody says you form an LLC, particularly when buying real estate, to protect yourself from liability. Well, what the liability they're talking about is if I buy a rental property and put it inside of an LLC and somebody falls off the back porch and dies, the claim is against that LLC first and foremost, because it is the owner of the property. We call that an inside out creditor, a creditor of an asset of the LLC suing that LLC first. Generally speaking, they cannot sue you personally unless they have a direct claim against you for that. So it's not that it completely protects you. If Emmerich dug the hole in the backyard that Mark fell into and died, he may be liable for that. The creditor they're not talking about is, what is the creditor of Emmerich as the owner of that LLC? What's their ability to get inside of that LLC to satisfy that judgment? Most LLCs, most single member LLCs, offer zero asset protection from me suing you trying to get inside of your LLC to get to your commercial property. And so, understanding the actual protections we get as part of that balance sheet is is part of that introductory job of triangulating what our true liability is in life.
Thank you. And then I'm pretty sure some people listening, they weren't aware of that. I know they weren't aware of that because that's the common myth that we travel under so much in business, that an LLC protects you. So anyway,
Well,
Daniel,
I want to interject. I want to interject really quick though, because the one thing that we need to make sure that we do when we do buy that commercial property in the LLC, and Mark helped me understand this as well, is the LLC needs to be named on the insurance policy. So back to what you said a few minutes ago, Mark, like proper insurances and proper protection is really where it starts through the insurances. And if that insured policy is just in your individual name and not in the LLC name, and then something happens, you may personally get sued for that because you don't have coverage that you need. So everyone listening, if you own a property that's in an LLC, that LLC needs to be named as a person on the insurance policy. So if you do have an issue, we can try to keep it encapsulated to just that entity and not allow it to exceed that and get into your personal life, your personal assets. Now, Mark, when you think about that whole setup that Emmerich just talked about, how do we actually move that from an LLC? Let's go through the process of like if that commercial property Emmerich's talking about is owned by an LLC, which is then inside of a trust that's owned by the LLC. Like, walk through that process on how you would protect that commercial asset, that commercial policy, or that commercial asset. And not allow it to escape, not allow it to get into the trust, because suing a trust and getting into the trust and getting money out of it is so much more difficult than just a sole LLC or just an individual property policy and such. Does that make sense?
Well, sure. I mean, and we can probably talk about it in more of a general idea. And, it's active versus passive ownership. There is if Mark owns a LLC that owns a commercial property and Mark is the one property managing it or whatever else, there is always the concern that even if the primary claim is against the owner of the property, there's a secondary claim against the operator. By shifting the ownership to a passive owner versus the active operator, passive owners, when they find a mouse in a soda bottle, the shareholders of the soda company don't get sued. They are passive shareholders that aren't involved in the active operations. Same thing, planning 101 can be, if Mark is the active operator, put the assets in spouse's name, because spouse has protections because a creditor of Mark is not a creditor of my spouse. Trusts are the more advanced way of doing that, where instead of just taking it off of your balance sheet on your spouse's balance sheet, you take it off of both of your balance sheets and move it over to a different structure. It's really just, and it's not all trusts are created equal would be a great, interjecting point here. I mean, one of the things that we were actually talking about this with a client yesterday, they were sold a revocable trust or a living trust by their attorney in the Northeast. They thought they had asset protection with that structure. Revocable trust offers zero asset protection. There is no protection available to that. You need irrevocable or inter vivos trust created to generate that asset protection. And so it's one of the fun things that we get to do is you chop up what a client has and figure out what the best path for them and their balance sheet to it is. Oftentimes, where skies are blue, but we're being protected for the future. Shifting things off balance sheet to spouses or trust do come into play often.
And it's a simple thing to understand. Again, the creditors against Daniel are not the creditors against Rocio, who's my wife. It's different. And so by being able to move these things around like that allows that protection to where you want to control everything and own nothing. The trust owns everything. And then we have beneficiaries of the trust that make the decisions on behalf of the trust, to where Daniel Dixon does not own anything really at all on paper. And listeners, I want you to understand, I kind of get it. And Mark and I have had this conversation probably, Mark, 6 times? I'm like, no, just start over again and then walk me through that. Like, this is not this is a very complex concept that I always want to know, what are the people 10xing what I'm doing or doing in life? What does that look like, and what are they achieving, and how do they protect these things? And then we're not going to get into it today, but that then also goes into inheritance tax and how the trust pays and how we can escape some of the tax liability for your heirs in putting everything together. It blew my mind that I can have all my businesses in a trust, which then also protects the businesses from creditors and from lawsuits and some of those other things. That's not just Daniel Dixon running everything. We have LLCs that do the things and so on. We have everything encapsulated in this entity that protects as we continue to grow and expand. And back to our conversation earlier about doing it earlier rather than later. Can you talk for a minute, Mark, about how do you get something into a trust? If you take these people's real estate businesses or their flipping businesses or some of the properties that they own, when we move that into a trust, how do we do it at the least amount of cost versus, because the trust has to buy the asset. And if the trust buys the asset early, the value of the asset is lower than if the trust buys the asset at a later date, right?
Well, it's like, I mean, typical lawyer answer in that it depends, right? Generally speaking, you have to sell or gift an asset into a trust. That sale or gift is done at, is valued at fair market value. And so there are limits on how much you can gift in life. It's currently $12.92 million. I think that's going to be $13.61 million next year with the inflation adjustment. That number is a political football that is, historically jumped around, and there's fear that it drops down to $6 million per person in 2026. But I mean, as a general proposition, the earlier you do it, the lower the value of the asset is.
Right. Now, let's switch gears really quick. And as we're getting ready to wrap this up, let's talk about the estate. We've talked a little bit about trust and moving things into trust. Let's talk about estate planning. Let's talk about the importance of estate planning and why we need to forward think and why we need to create these. I think one of the powerful conversations we had is, Daniel, if you and your wife die, who's in charge of the estate? Who's making the decisions? How much money do the kids get? Do all the kids get money equally? Let's run through some of those questions that we talked about, because these were things that A, I never thought about, B, made me sad thinking about, and C, were absolutely had to get answered to make sure that the lineage, my heirs, our empire that we're building is protected through and through. So we don't have my son or daughter marry some random that then has an ability to come in and take things from the estate.
And the simplest answer to that question is, if we're not thoughtful and breathe life into what our goals and objectives are, we're going to be subject to state law defaults. Those state law defaults are almost, absent a real lucky turn of what our wishes are never going to be consistent with what our values and objectives are. And so
go deeper on that a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, general proposition is state law defaults are going to be outright distributions to people. Outright distributions just, turn the money over to whoever the recipient of it is. That doesn't.
So hold on. So I can die, and then the state determines who gets to run the money and everything?
Correct. And different states have different hierarchies and different people of who can be in charge. And, ultimately there's no substitute for putting in what Daniel wants in Daniel's plan. And if, doesn't matter that, Marc Dearth is number one in priority in whatever state that is. He wants spouse, or he wants Emmerich, or whoever else running it. We want you to be the master of your domain and say how you want things, who you want in charge of running the playbook that you've put together, who you want stewarding this and shepherding this to wherever you want it to go, be it to business partners, be it to charity, be it to your family, or be it to others. And, thoughtfully do that. I mean, so many plans are, the most common structure you see in trust is called an ascertainable standard, a health, education, maintenance, and support standard. It is nearly ubiquitous in the planning world because its function is to take limited assets and last as long as possible by distributing it out for people's baseline needs. When you add any modicum of wealth in that, that's the term that gives rise to trust fund baby, trust fund mentality, trustafarians. It's a disincentivizing goal or a disincentivizing option, because if I'm successful enough to meet my baseline health, education, maintenance, and support needs, the trust is required to give me money. Well, most creators of wealth, don't want to incentivize lack of achievement. They typically like to reward it rather than penalize it. And so coming up with a plan to navigate that and, create the asset protections. I mean, one of the things my wife and I talk about all the time is my boys are 16 and 12. Like, we want nothing more than to create a legacy and a generational wealth for them. But we don't want them to be able to do something stupid and at 25, 35, and 45 and lose what we've worked a lifetime to create. And so, creating our plan and talking about, how we want it to work and who we want in charge and how we want to steward that is, it's not always fun. Sometimes you got to eat your vegetables and knock out the block and tackle planning along the way, right?
Mm-hmm. And so, Mark, when you're having that conversation, right, a lot of us, we make we're having an emotional conversation. And how do you, and I'm saying you particularly, how do you help people remove the emotion from that and come back to practicality? Because that's a really emotional conversation when you're doing that type of planning and putting those things in place. And it's not, it may not be popular to put one person in charge as opposed to another person, and you have to take the emotion out and just come back to practicality.
Well, I mean, and so two of my favorite sayings that I would say are tenets of how we approach things. Number one goal should be pick good people, give them the ability to make good decisions. I love panels. Different people can have different perspectives on what a creator of wealth would want. But if we have, a wisdom of crowds approach where we have three people that we've picked that we trust that know us well, mathematically they're going to reach the best conclusion more often than not by putting their heads together and talking about it. Two is, I'll say probably 3 points. Two is sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. Like, talking about it and being open and honest rather than hiding away from it and avoiding uncomfortable conversations is by far and away the best approach to planning of any sort, whether it's business decisions, personal estate planning, or whatever else. Open, honest communication is the foundation of every relationship. What do you say, Daniel?
I said getting married, all of those things. Sun is the best disinfectant. Like, have the tough conversations. Let's talk about what we want. Let's talk about what it looks like. Let's talk about what our needs are, and so on. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And then, on top of that, you try to do it with levity and logic. I mean, it's, like, nobody gets out of this place alive. We're all going to pass away someday. Like, we can leave it to state law defaults because we want to be emotionally avoidant and miss the topics of conversation, or we can tackle it head on and let it be an empowering process to say, we're not going to, settle for state law defaults for our family. We're going to demand better of our, the legacy that we're creating and design something that is robust and material, not flimsy and weak.
Yeah. We had this stoked a conversation in our household with my children lately, where it was like, all right, well, if mom and dad pass, do you guys think everything should be split equally? Well, no. Well, why not? Well, because what if so-and-so is working harder than so-and-so? Do they get more of the estate? Do they get more of the money and of the inheritance? Or are we splitting equally? Or is there a hierarchy in it? What if someone has, this is one of the things Brett was talking about as well with me, is what if someone has drug problems? Does that mean they're out? Or are we going to pay for some of rehab exactly? And again, these are questions that have never flowed through my brain, and not something I would need to think about my 12 and my 10-year-old, my 5-year-old being drug addicts, and whether or not they have access to all the stuff that I built over my entire life. And how do we avoid giving them access at 18? Is it 35? Is it 30? Like, so you just create these mile markers in these questions. And I think one thing that you did really well, Mark, is give us the grace to say, hey, this is not set in stone. This is an intention, and then we're going to map this out today. And we're going to revisit this every couple of years and see, do we need to change somebody on that panel that's the decision-making person? Do we need to pivot based on what colleges we want them to go to? Or is a 4-year college the same as a trade school? Like, just all of these things, it's not set in stone, and it's not here set it and forget it forever. But this is a baseline to make a decision and then lean into it for a little bit and then start pivoting and growing through that process.
It's like I paid you to tee up one of my other favorite sayings. Don't let great be the enemy of good. As Daniel Dixon and I talk today, it is impossible for us to solve 50 years from now. The most mathematically likely situation is that we're sitting here 3 years today, 5 years from today, 10 years from today, looking back wistfully on all the things that we thought we knew that we didn't as young men, right? And so let's get a plan in place that works in for 5 years, for 10 years, for 3 years, knowing that the most likely outcome is that we're going to get a chance to come together and revisit it and fine tune and improve going forward. And that is estate plan. That is approach to balance sheet for asset preservation, tax minimization, and everything else. It is a lifelong journey and undertaking to do it as best we can. And so often clients let great be the enemy of good and just not start down the path because it's such a daunting process.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things where I believe that a lot of times it just comes from fear of loss. You don't want to lose. You don't want to lose things. You don't want to lose assets, or you don't want to lose control, or you don't want to have a loss. So either sometimes you don't do anything, or you make your mind up to do something without wise counsel, and it's not the best decision because you're operating from scarcity rather than abundance. And then you said something great where seek progress. Basically, you said seek progress, not perfection. It's never going to be perfectly right. But it's got to be better than what it was before you started.
I might steal that line: seek progress, not perfection.
Emmerich has a lot of great one-liners and quotes, and I don't know, Emmerich, give us another one. Do you have another one off the top of your head right now? Come on, I know it's there.
You know what? And this falls right in line with this. You do the things today other people aren't willing to do, so you can do the things tomorrow other people can't do. That's for you, Daniel.
I love that, especially where we're at in the industry right now. Is exactly. A lot of people don't want to do what everyone else is unwilling to do right now, and it's important.
And I would say, we got to say next year they won't be able to do it because you're so far ahead of them they can't even catch up.
That's the goal, isn't it? Well, as we're wrapping this up, Mark, I mean, thanks, listeners. Like, I recommend you go listen to this episode 2 or 3 times because there's so much in it. And what I did when I met with Mark and when I've met with a couple of my mentors, my wealth coach, some other folks, is I'd get concepts and then I'd go Google and research. What does this mean exactly? And then prompt a few more questions so I can get an understanding of what the hell are they talking about? Because Mark's talking like this is easy stuff. Oh yeah, we just do this and we do that and we just put it over there. And I'm like, bro, none of this makes any sense to me, to be honest with you. Luckily, I trust you and I can get your advice on what we do exactly. But then going and understanding, this is why we set the trust up that way. This is why we have a panel. This is why we have an executor. This is why we set the trust up this way with this person granting such as. This is why my real estate business needs to be inside the trust now versus in 5 years from now as we make even more money and the valuation of the company continues to grow. So re-listen, take notes, Google, research. Obviously, I'm here. I mean, I don't know all of it, and I'm certainly not an attorney, but I'm here to support and help and answer questions and make intros and do the things because this is where I know we talk a lot about mindset and a lot about generational wealth and what we're trying to achieve with this podcast, but this is truly one of the most important pieces of all of it. Because if this shit isn't done right, then it is all going to go away from everything that we worked so hard to create over the years.
And just so Mark, just so that everybody's clear, this is not a plug for Mark. However, it is a plug for Mark. And when we having these conversations, good advice doesn't cost you, it pays you. So don't worry, don't focus so much on how much it's going to cost you to get this information. Focus on what's the benefit of getting the information. So good advice doesn't cost you, it pays you. Time and time again. I'm pretty sure you can agree with that one, Daniel. It's like, if I had not, what is the cost? What's the lost opportunity cost?
Well, and I'll
What's
say
your
it different 'cause I think you guys both hit on it and how I would say it. Like to me, the most important thing and what I love about you, Daniel, is you're curious. So many find advisors that are willing to answer your questions and have the conversations with you. So many advisors think it's better to, silo relationships, and they want to just talk to you and make you go talk to their CPA because they don't want to disagree and feel that they don't own relationships. They want to use big words to show you how smart they are. Well, like that doesn't, if Daniel goes to the holiday party and says Mark's the smartest guy I know, or my CPA is the smartest guy I know, and nobody knows what he's talking about, that doesn't make anybody look good. But when Daniel can go and say, well, like I have some really thoughtful conversations with my guy and he's educating me and like, giving me things to think about and look at, like that's where true change and growth mindset come from, is the idea that we're learning and building upon it, and not just putting things in because somebody used a bunch of big words and sent us a bill for
it. Absolutely. Well, now that we're wrapping up here, Mark, let's go with two things that the listeners can do right now to start the process of asset protection, estate planning. Like what do they need to leave this podcast? What's the first thing that they need to do? And then what's the follow-up on that to start building this process?
They need to go create a exact personal financial statement is number one. I don't care about format, whether it's an SBA form, whether it's a piece of paper, but I want to know assets, like how it's titled. Is it in an LLC? Is it in your individual name? Is it in spouse's name? Is it in joint name? What debt is associated with it and everything else? A true picture of what they have and that they can share with every advisor on their team, coaches, CPAs, attorneys, financial advisors, insurance guys. That is the key opening door to have meaningful, thoughtful conversations about where they go next. Number two is, I think, get your team around you. That team almost typically starts with having a good CPA. And it's not just the H&R Block guy preparing our tax returns, somebody who's thoughtfully engaging with us on our things. It may, from there, it can be attorney next. It can be financial advisor. It can be insurance guy. But build your tribe around you of your advisors who are looking out for you. And don't find the guy who does legal work, CPA, insurance, and just changes hats to sell you something different. Find people that are independent, that are taking care of you, not trying to sell you something.
Cool. I think that I would add one more thing is make sure that your insurances, A, have enough coverage in the different silos, and B, that we all have an umbrella policy that can encapsulate a lot of the risk through. I know we talked about, what if I don't get in an accident? So we'll use my wife, for instance. What if she drives and she hits somebody in a Bentley or a Ferrari or something crazy? Do we have enough protection inside of these policies? Not just our typical collision policy, but then escalating that through an umbrella policy to absolve all of the risk and not allow it to leak out into these other things that we have.
And I'll say, like, it's a great tag on to that. I don't necessarily subscribe to this, but I think it's a good general rule. There is a school of thought in the world that you get a $2 or $3 million umbrella policy because there's never a lawyer who wouldn't take a $2 million check to walk away. I think that's probably true 80% of the time, but it's a good rule of thumb as a starting point.
Good stuff. Emric, any last words?
No, my last word is make an appointment. Figure out where you have to figure out where we are. Find a trusted professional and schedule an appointment as soon as possible. Don't worry about do you have things right. Don't worry about do you have things together. What you have to worry about is, do you have a person who can trust to guide you in the best direction? Good advice doesn't cost you, it pays you.
Yeah, agreed. And Mark, I don't know what your capacity looks like, but I'd love to get you more and more of our listeners and people inside of our community to help protect this and grow this. So if you guys are interested, just message me on social. I'll create an intro, connect with Mark's people, and see if we can start the journey of protecting the things that we have. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Marc. This was incredibly impactful. I know you mean so much to me and my family and what we're doing and the questions I can bounce off of you and how you have these trusted advisors that really want to teach you and not just send you an invoice. And I appreciate that dearly. Appreciate our friendship. I appreciate that we look very similar. Definitely. I think we could be brothers, right? At least.
I'm definitely the older brother with the extra gray.
There you go. I appreciate the conversation. This is super important, and I think for a lot of the listeners, your mortality can be your biggest problem. So think forward. Think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road. It's difficult for us young folks. Me and Emmerich have gotten in arguments about this because it's difficult for me to see 20, 30 years down the road. But if we plant the right seeds today and we do the right things today, it's going to make everything so much easier as we continue on this journey of success and growth and expansion. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much. And until next time, friends.
Thank you, guys. This was fun. Appreciate you all.
Thank you, Marc. Thanks, Daniel.
Follow the Color of Money podcast today and get notified when new episodes are released weekly.
Be part of this transformative listening experience.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. The views, thoughts, and opinions of the guest represent those of the guest and not KWRI and its affiliates, and should not be construed as financial, economic, legal, tax, or other advice. This podcast is provided without any warranty or guarantee of its accuracy, completeness, timeliness, or results from using the information.